Okay.
Okay, I'll tell most fun thing I did when I was a child. It was when I was 7, and World War II had just ended. My family, gasoline was no longer rationed, so people could travel, and so we had our first family vacation then when I was 7, and we drove to Florida, from Tennessee to Florida, to visit relatives that lived in Leesburg, Florida, sort of in the middle of the state. And I had never seen the ocean, and I just couldn't imagine what it was like. Well, our relatives drove us over to Daytona Beach one day while we were there, and on the way to the beach, I kept asking my cousin, who was a teenager, I kept saying, "How much sand is at a beach?" And he said, "There's so much sand at the beach, it just goes on forever. You just look and you." I said, "But like how much?" And he said, "You can't possibly count it." And I remember thinking, what will that be like? I mean, I had seen pictures, I guess. But anyway, we get to the beach, and we just had the most wonderful time. Everybody in the family got into the surf, and we held hands and jumped over the waves, and it was just like ecstasy. And then afterwards, this would have been 1946. There really wasn't anywhere in sight that where we could change our clothes, our wet clothes. So we just dried off in the car, and with all that salt water and everything. But you know, when you're a kid, that doesn't matter. And then we drove to a restaurant to have fried oysters. And again, I had never had fried oysters. And we sat at this table, kind of on a patio, eating those oysters, and it was like, you know, the happiest day of my life as a kid. It was wonderful. And then to mention other fun things, it's interesting because the things that stand out tend to be when I was traveling. And I've been lucky to live in many parts of the world, in Asia, South America, and Africa, as well as, of course, here in this country. And so, I mean, I could talk all day, but I'll just mention one. It was when my husband and I were living in Saigon, Vietnam, in 1962. We were there for more than 2 years, but in '62, my sister came to visit us from Hawaii, and the three of us, flew to Cambodia, to Phnom Penh, and then we flew north to visit Angkor Wat, these famous ruins called Angkor Wat, and they date back to a culture, the Khmer culture, that lived. I think they flourished in about 500 of this era, and maybe a little bit later than that. Anyway, these ruins were lost for centuries, and a French explorer discovered them, I think, in the early 1900s, I think. Anyway, they're open to tourists now, and they're well known now. But we went to Angkor Wat and spent a whole week staying in a French hotel a couple of miles away, and then every day we would rent I forget what they called it, but it was basically a Jeep that would come and get us and drive us to the ruins. And every day, these ruins are extensive, and the jungle is just grown in on them, and most have been cleared, but some of them have been left, where you have these big statues of kings, and then the roots of trees have just twisted them all up. It's sort of like the poem Ozymandias, you know, the idea that people think they're so powerful, but in the end, nature will probably move in and erase what was left. I mean, it could be centuries later, but you know, people are not going to last forever. Nothing is eternal in this earth. So it was just wonderful. We'd get out in the morning, we'd come home, it would always rain with monsoon rain. We'd have a French lunch, and then take a nap, and it would rain, and then we'd wake up, and the sun would have come out. We'd get another Jeep, go back to another ruin, and a couple times we climbed up a ruin that was high and looked out over the sunset, and it was a really fabulous time.
Cool. Okay. Were you involved in any wars, or was anyone you loved involved in any wars?
You know, I was not, and no one really close in my family was involved. The closest, I would say, was a second cousin, a young man who was killed in the Pacific in World War II. He had come to visit our family. I mean, I did not know him well, but he was a handsome, blonde guy. That's my memory. He had come to visit us before being sent out to the Pacific. He was on a ship, and he was in the Navy. And I just remember he was so handsome, and he came to visit all the relatives and then left. And then one day I came home from school in the first grade, so this would have been either the fall of '44 or the winter spring of '45. Is that what I say? Yeah. Yeah, the war in the Pacific didn't end until August of '45, so I guess it was near the end of the war. And I came home from school, first grade, and my mother met me at the door, and she said, Owen, his name was Owen Thompson, Owen was shot down, was killed. His ship was attacked, and so his mother was my great aunt. We called her Aunt Irma, and my mother said, Aunt Irma is here, she said, in our house now, and she said, she's in the guest room resting, and don't go in there. So that's what I remember, being told that my great aunt, who was grieving the loss of her son, was at my house, and I was to be quiet and stay out of the way. And of course, we all felt really sad. So that's the closest encounter I've had with war. I mean, I was almost in a war when we lived in Vietnam, but I was not a combatant. We were living in Saigon when my husband and I, in 1962, we just arrived there, and we were having breakfast one morning, and all of a sudden we heard this boom, and the house shook, and then another boom, and then we heard all of a sudden, coming from the corner of our street, our block, an anti-aircraft gun, trying to shoot a plane down that was bombing, because we didn't know what was happening, and the house was shaking. We didn't know what to do. We just arrived overseas, so we got under our dining table, and it went on for about, I don't know, 20 minutes, maybe 30, and then it stopped. And we later learned that a renegade pilot had decided, and there may have been two of them, each dropping bombs, had decided to bomb the presidential palace. The president, his name was Ngo Dinh Diem, was extremely unpopular, and their administration, his administration, was not good, and they were oppressive to the people, and the people were getting very restive, and you knew something was up. And eventually he was overthrown in a coup d'état, which was even more dangerous. I mean, it wasn't a war that we were fighting, but we were close to, let's say, we were close to civil conflict, and it was very scary. We were 2 blocks from the palace. That's why our house was shaking every time the bombs came down. And then the coup d'état was more like a war, but it lasted all afternoon and all night, so it's not very long. And there were cannons and a lot of noises and bullets flying, but we were actually, turned out we were safe being at home that day. Anyway.
That's cool.
Yeah.
What is the greatest injustice you have ever witnessed? Explain.
Well, I would say the segregation that I described earlier. I mean, that's to see that and to grow up, a young child, forming your personality and your character forming, to be in the middle of that kind of injustice to people that have done nothing wrong. It's just, yeah, that was hard. And then I was an young adult during the Civil Rights Movement. We were overseas. My husband and I were overseas for the whole 60s almost, the whole 60s decade. But of course we knew what was going on. We were keeping up with the news as best we could, of course, way before email and all that. But yeah, I would say that would be the most. If there's time, I can say more about injustices today, but for now we can let that be my answer.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. Tell your favorite story about your spouse. If you don't have one, tell your favorite story about one of your closest friends.
These questions, you know, there could be so many answers to them. So it's hard to choose one. It really is. When you've lived as long as I have, there's so many stories. But I'll tell one. I did have a wonderful husband who is no longer living. But I'll tell my favorite story about my closest friend. Her name is Judy. And this is a story that happened. It's just an exciting story. She was giving birth to her second child in India when she was given, they were giving her some kind of anesthetic, and I think it was a difficult birth, and she had an out-of-body experience. It was like she was almost dying. She said that she felt herself moving up to the ceiling, and she could look down and see her body, and she saw her husband was there, and he was so worried, the doctor and the nurse, they were trying to, you know, they were delivering a baby, and she was knocked out, and obviously knocked out too much. And then the next thing she knew, she could see, she said, it was like all of my past lives came to me. They were, she said, imagine it was like a roll of movie film with little frames, and each frame was, she said, what I understood that to be, each frame had been a life that I had lived earlier. In other words, it seemed that reincarnation is real. That's how it felt to her. And she said the last life, she saw herself as a little Jewish tradesman in Europe. And she was born in 1943, so the Holocaust had been going on for some years, and many Jews in Europe had already been killed. So she saw herself as a person in that Holocaust, just like that. And then the next thing that happened, she was completely surrounded by warm, bright light. She said, I can't explain how, she said there are no human words to describe this, but the light, this bright light, and this feeling of love, she said, just love that I've never known, just totally surrounded me. And she said, she said, it was so overwhelming that I said, so this is what it's all about. And she heard this voice say, yes, this is what it's all about. And it makes me almost weep, because if this is true, I mean, it's just, to me, this is just fantastic to think that there is that kind of love somewhere we don't always experience it here on earth. But after that, she said she was told she had to go back to earth. She couldn't. She said she understood, whether it was being spoken or what, that she couldn't stay here, even though she kind of wanted to. She had to go back to earth. It was kind of like, your time's not up. And then she said, for a minute, I didn't know if I was being born or giving birth. I didn't know. And she said it was like, she looked down, it was, imagine a grid, and one of those is her lifeline, and she has to take that one and go back down to earth. And she said, I did get the right place on the grid, and she went back down and inhabited her own body down on the operating table, delivery table. And then just, I'll add one more thing to that, because it's part of the story. She was growing up in Nashville, Tennessee. Her father was off in the war, and her mother and she were living with relatives. She said that she didn't know any people who were Jewish, and she didn't even know what Judaism was. I mean, she was just a little kid. She didn't know much about religion or anything like that. But she said she always, whenever somebody talked about a Jew or a Jewish, anything that had to do with Judaism, that she knew that she had a connection to that. She was always very, just felt connected to Judaism, even though she didn't even know what it was. And then later, as she grew up, and she became very interested in, and she did visit Israel, and you know, learned about the Jewish religion and some of the rituals and all, and she said it all seemed very, very comfortable, very warm, and a part of her. So that's sort of the capstone of that whole story. So that's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah,
Very
it's
moving story to
very
me.
moving, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Talk about your children. How many did you have, and how fun or hard were they to raise?
Not particularly hard to raise. I have three. The two boys, Mark and Kevin, were born when my husband and I lived in Taiwan in the mid '60s, and that was very interesting. When my first child was born, Mark, he was born on July 17th, and my husband went out as soon as he was born and everything was fine. He went out to send a telegram back here to the States to the two sets of grandparents. He was the first grandchild on both sides of the family, so it was a big event. So he telegrammed that their first grandchild was born, Mark Stephen, and on July 17th, and they received the telegram on July 16th because because of the international date line, Asia, that part of the world, is always a day ahead. So they got the news on the 16th that their son had been born on the 17th. That was kind of interesting. But I'll finish then. So those two boys were born in Taiwan, and then later our daughter Jennifer was born here in Fairfax County. By that time we had moved back to the Washington area, and they're very different. All three of my kids. There's family resemblance. If you saw them, you might know they were related in all of them. But as far as their personalities and interests, they could hardly be more different. My oldest is a teacher. He teaches special ed children in Montgomery County, and he and his wife have my only grandchild, my granddaughter, Chloe, who's almost 14 and now taller than I am. And then Kevin, my middle son, middle child and second son, is a businessman. He was always very interested and good in math, and so he ended up getting an MBA, and his field is consulting, financial work on computers. That's about the best way I can describe it. And he lives here he lives in Arlington. And Jennifer is interested in writing. She always was a good writer and had a good imagination. And I'm a writer too, and so I can understand, in a way I can understand her interests even more than my son's. I've been a teacher too, so maybe that wasn't so surprising that Mark went into teaching. But she works for an online news agency in the Bay Area, and wants to be a writer. She wants to write creative nonfiction, and she's wanting to, she has to work to pay the bills, but then on her off time she's writing essays, and she's getting her first essay is being published next month in a journal. So my kids are when she has her birthday in about 2 weeks, they will all be in their 40s. She's turning 40 this year, and they're, as I said, very different in personality and interests. The oldest one is a kayaker. He was an actor for a while. The middle one is he loves tennis and basketball. Jennifer is not as interested in sports, but she stays very fit. She walks and bicycles and does yoga. So they have just different ways of, being healthy people. And I think they're all, I'm proud of them because I think they are all good people that are contributing to good in the world. They all work. They work hard. They're fun to be around. They're kind of like their dad. He had a really good sense of humor. They all have a good sense of humor, and they're neat people. So and the longer I live, the more I believe that maybe the best thing that any of us can do for society is to be a good parent, raise good kids.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Have you ever broken the law? If so, were you caught, and what was your punishment? Did you think it was fair? Why or why not?
You know, I have broken the law a couple of times, but not in a way that anyone was hurt. And there was no business about being caught. One time, after I was in my 30s, I believe, or 40s, maybe, around 40, a friend had a friend who grew marijuana, and so she said, "Would you like to try it?" I had never tried any drugs at all. I had a very sheltered early childhood and youth, and so I said, "Yeah, I wouldn't want to try anything like, stronger than marijuana, but yeah, I've always been curious about it." So they had but I said, I would not get it from a stranger because I understand it can be contaminated. But if it's pure, yeah, I'd like to give it a try in a safe location. So there were 4 of us, the 2 friends that got the marijuana that was good stuff, and my husband and I, and so we smoked it, and just one evening, and that would have been against the law. It was an interesting experience. I didn't care to do it again, but it was fun. And then another time, I was asked by a friend to bring some jewels into the country from Taiwan into the States, and I was scared to do it and hated to say no to them, and so I did. So when we came back across the border, I did have those jewels with me, and I did not declare them, so that was illegal. But I did it for a friend, and she was sending jewelry back to her daughter. This is a Chinese family, and her daughter was in the States getting married, and there was some family, I don't know what they were, I mean, I can't remember, it's been so long ago, gold and some stones, and she wanted to get them to her daughter, so that was illegal. I think that those are the only 2 things I've done that are illegal, other than maybe scooting through on a yellow light that turned red. I know I've done that a few times. And I've been caught speeding a couple times. Not dangerously, but not recklessly, but being a few points above the speed limit. That's illegal. So I was caught on those, that's right. I did pay a fine for that.
All right. What is your favorite holiday story with your family or friends? Why?
I think my favorite is the Thanksgiving that our family and another family that were close friends of ours forever, and still are, we decided to spend Thanksgiving at Chincoteague. So we did all the cooking. We rented a house just for that. I guess it was maybe 4 days. I think we drove down on Wednesday, probably came back on Saturday or Sunday, probably Sunday. So we rented out an old house, and there must have been, that family had 3 children, we had 3 children. So there must have been 10 of us, and then my mother was visiting for the holiday, so she made 11. So we cooked a turkey, we did everything we would have done, all the same, the salads and the veggies and the desserts, and took it all to Chincoteague. And we got to the house, it was freezing cold. It took all night for the house to warm up, but it did warm up, and we had a wonderful Thanksgiving. And even though it was foggy and rainy, we did get out quite a bit. And I guess Thanksgiving evening, after we'd had our wonderful dinner, we sat around in the living room and read plays together. That was fun. And the one I remember was Inherit the Wind. It was very apropos, being about a racial themed play. Not racial, but Inherit the Wind. The theme about the creation story opposed to scientific theories about how the creation was formed. And it was about a trial that happened in Tennessee. So there was my mother. We let her read the lines for some of the more southern characters in the play. So that was a wonderful holiday.
What other interesting stories do you have? Please share as many as you can think of.
Well, that's your last question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'll just take a couple here, not to take too much more time. I've always wanted to write, and when I was just a little girl, before I could physically write, I was writing stories, and my mother would write them down. I would draw the pictures and then tell the story, and my mother would write the words. And I'll still have some of those little books. I just always wanted to write. And the first time I wrote a book that was published, I wrote it with a friend, the first English language guidebook to Bolivia. We were living in Bolivia at that time, in La Paz, Bolivia. And that was really exciting to write. You know, we spent at least a year, and we would interview people in Spanish and English, and then put it all into English, and it was a wonderful experience. And then it was published, and we knew it would be a valuable book because, again, there was no English language guidebook to that country. Bolivia is a traveler's paradise. It has everything from the highest mountains to the Amazon Valley and everything in between, and scenery that's like the North American West. I mean, just amazing scenery. So we were glad to get that all between two covers, and that book sold out very quickly. But by that time we had left Bolivia, and we were not in a position to keep updating it, and we gave the rights to that to an American who's married to a Bolivian and is living his whole life in Bolivia. So he is continuing it, and I've seen a more recent edition of it, and in that he mentions my friend and my name, and said that we were the first ones to write this book. And then when I came back to the States later in life, when I was, I guess, in my 40s, I took a job as a religious educator at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Arlington. A friend and another friend, I tend to collaborate, so almost all the things that I'm proud of, like, you know, career things, were done with another person and in collaboration. And I'm still collaborative. I'll say a little bit more about that. But my friend and I, in our time at the Unitarian Church, we wrote 2 curriculums that are full-year curriculums. One is on the Hebrew Scriptures, the wisdom of the Hebrew Scriptures, and the other one is on the life and teachings of Jesus, and called Jesus and His Kingdom of Equals. And I'm very proud of those. They're still being sold. The Jesus curriculum is marketed by a California publishing company that is connected with the Jesus Seminar. It's a scholarly institution, and then with another friend, I co-wrote some books on intergenerational worship, because we designed worship services for several years that would be appropriate for children and for adults, and people were saying, well, can you help us, you know, can you give us your ideas? And we realized we just needed to write it all down, and then we had the books. So those are parts of my life that I'm proud of. And just one more thing, and then we'll wind this up. Here I live in a retirement community called Goodwin House, Bailey's Crossroads in Fairfax, Virginia, and a friend and I founded the Green Team several years ago, about 8 years ago maybe, and it has about 20 members, and we are the environmental arm of the residents here. we work closely with staff and residents, and we keep the recycling organized, and we've gotten rid of styrofoam almost entirely. When I came here, a lot of styrofoam was used for coffee and carry out, and the green team has changed that. When the bistro was built, we have a dining room that's been here since the beginning. This is 25 years old, this facility. The bistro opened up about 4 years ago. And we went to the dining services folks and said, look, the green team would like to help you